A quorum being present, the Committee on Education and Labor will come to order. Today, we have one item scheduled for markup, H.R. 2187, the 21st Century School Green High Performing Schools Facilities Act. I put an extra school in there. Legislation to improve school buildings across country and inject jobs into our economy. I will begin with an opening statement, and then I will yield to Mr. McKeon for his opening statement. Last year, the House passed a measure similar to H.R. 2187 with bipartisan support. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act allows districts to use resources they receive under State Fiscal Stabilization Fund for school modernization. This bill builds on that effort. School modernization is an economic stimulus. It creates jobs quickly while meeting critical public infrastructure needs. This bill has an even greater potential than before to meet several of our most pressing challenges at once while making smart long-term investments. First, the bill will get us closer to our goal for providing every child with a world-class education by providing more students and teachers a safe, healthy, environmentally friendly learning environment. Second, this bill will help revive our economy by creating hundreds of thousands of construction jobs and increasing the supply purchases. Many of these jobs will specialize in retrofitting and greening classrooms, giving workers valuable skills in green economy. And third, by improving energy efficiency in our schools, this bill will help us move toward a clean energy economy and generate savings for the districts in the long run. As our committee learned in hearings last year, too many of our schools are literally crumbling. The conditions range from moderately bad to dangerous, and in some cases, students attend schools with leaky roofs, no air conditioning, and sweltering heat. According to a recent report by the American Federation of Teachers, it would cost almost $255 billion to fully renovate and repair all the schools in the country. In 2005, the American Civil Society of Engineers gave schools a D on National Infrastructure Report Card. This need is only intensified with the economic downturn, and state education budgets are taking a harder hit, leaving schools with even fewer resources to make repairs and renovations. This isn't good for students' health or their achievement. Lighting, noise reduction, air quality, and other factors impact on how well teachers teach and schools learn. School facilities can also affect the teacher and principal retention. We can't expect teachers to want to stay in classrooms with exposed wires, cracked ceilings, or what did I say here? Okay. And asthma is also a leading cause of school absence during chronic illness, is made worse by poor indoor air quality. According to the American Lung Association, asthma accounted for more than 14 million missed days in 2000, about 8 days per student. Greening schools can both reduce school carbon footprint and improve students' health and learning. Green schools typically consume about 1/3 less energy and 1/3 less water than conventional schools. The U.S. Green Building Council estimates that this could save an average of about $100,000 each year in energy and other costs. And we think that's a reason to consider this bill. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. McKeon.
Thank you, Chairman Miller, and good morning. There are a variety of reasons that I and other Republicans have with this bill, number of concerns. I'd like to sum up these with a few phrases. It costs too much, it borrows too much, it controls too much. And it's an area that, as federal legislators, we should not be intruding upon. First, there's concern about the cost. Last year, this committee marked up a very similar bill, which the Congressional Budget Office estimated would cost $20 billion over the next 5 years. If passed, this bill could divert funding from the Title I program for disadvantaged students. It also could take money away from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. When the federal government set up the IDEA program in 1975, it told states it would pick up 40% of the cost of educating these students. But despite enormous progress, especially over the past decade, we still aren't meeting that commitment. Members on this side of the aisle think we should meet our existing commitments, such as IDEA, and a brand new federal school construction program does nothing to accomplish that goal. Now let's take a look at another problem with this bill. It borrows too much. The $20 billion price tag may not seem like very much in these days of multi-billion-dollar bailouts and trillion-dollar federal budgets, but it does add up. Right now, the federal government is estimated to run a nearly $2 trillion deficit this year alone. The national debt stands at around $11 trillion and growing, thanks to bills like this one. We need to get the federal budget under control. If we don't, the children we're trying to help today will be paying off our debts and our deficits for the rest of their lives, instead of paying for their own dreams and destinies. Finally, Mr. Chairman, this bill controls too much in an area the federal government doesn't have any business meddling in. Yes, the federal government can play a limited but helpful role in education, but this bill is not limited or helpful. It would nationalize and regulate the building and maintenance of schools across the nation, from small towns and rural outposts to large cities and urban centers. Like other federal construction projects, this new program carries with it the burden of Depression-era wage mandates. The Department of Labor's own Inspector General has found these wage requirements to be flawed, shortchanging either taxpayers, workers, or both. And it's not just the cost. Davis-Bacon creates red tape and regulatory hurdles that make it harder for smaller contractors, many owned by minorities or women, to win federal contracts. But the federal mandates don't end there. This bill even dictates the kind of flooring schools can use. I ask the American people, is this really something the federal government should be doing? Building and renovating schools would add to a growing list of areas the federal government now handles, such as the banking industry, the auto industry, and the credit industry. There are also plans for even more federal involvement in health care, and if the Obama administration gets its wish, the college loan industry as well. Just by itself, this bill would give the federal government more power than ever before. But when it stands with other recent bills and laws, it creates a clear and bleak picture of the future, a government of Washington, by Washington, and for Washington. We debated the question of whether the federal government ought to build schools when we debated the stimulus package earlier this year, and both parties in both chambers agreed that the answer was no. We should not create such a program. Of course, federal programs are made for loopholes, and the stimulus was no exception. We recently learned that states are planning to treat the state fiscal stabilization fund dollars, about $54 billion worth, as impact aid funding. In other words, unrestricted dollars that they can spend on anything they like, including new school construction. I think this is wrong, but it's happening, and it begs the question, why do we need to create another new program to do what the states already are able to do, if they so choose, under a stimulus enacted just a few short months ago? Mr. Chairman, I cannot support this bill. I know that you and your fellow Democrats are sincere in your efforts to improve the schools. I do recognize there is a need for school construction and renovation, but involving the federal government creates more problems than it solves. Thank you, Chairman Miller, and I yield back.
Thank you. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 2187, the 21st Century Green High Performing Public School Facilities Act.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading of the bill. Hearing no objection, so ordered. The clerk will offer amendment in the nature of I have offered an amendment in the nature of substitute.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Chairman Miller of California.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute will be considered the base text for the purpose of amendment, and the amendment will be considered and read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendments to substitute shall be considered as read. And if I might just take a quick minute to explain the substitute. The amendment in the nature of the substitute includes a number of member suggestions that I believe improve the underlying bill to ensure that the public school facilities databases that states will establish online are publicly searchable so parents and others can see the status of their children's school and compare it with other schools. Also, thanks to Mr. Polis, the substitute expands the reporting related to charter schools so that we can see how they're faring relative to all public schools in receiving these funds. It expands the areas to be covered by voluntary high-performing school guidelines that developed by the states, and I thank Mr. Tonko for his expertise in this area, also for adding energy audits as the use of funds, and also Ms. Davis for including the guidelines and reduction of water use and landscaping, a particular problem in California. The amendment, thanks to Mr. Wu, adds stormwater runoff, seismic code compliance, and additional renewable energy systems as allowable uses of the fund. Mr. Kucinich appropriately suggested expanding beyond simply paint and to look at all lead-based hazards that be mitigated, such as plumbing. And finally, thanks to Mr. Andrews, the strengthening of language that allows school districts to use green building standards, the equivalent of those explicitly listed in the legislation. I want to thank the members for their involvement, their interest in this matter. Do you have any statement? Are there other members who wish to speak on this? Mr. Kildee, speak to the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, for holding this markup of the 21st Century Green High-Performing Public School Facilities Act that I joined Representative Chandler and Loebsack and you in introducing. I'm particularly pleased with the enthusiasm, the knowledge, and the tenacity of who was then a freshman. This bill was introduced in the last Congress, Mr. Loebsack from Iowa. He really put this bill into motion, and I observed him as a freshman, now a sophomore, who understood the need for this bill, refined the bill, and I look forward to seeing him standing with the President of the United States as he signs this bill into law. This legislation will bring critically needed resources to schools around the country to provide students and teachers with safe, healthy, modern, energy-efficient, and environmentally friendly learning spaces, and will help our local, state, and national economies by creating jobs for thousands of workers to build these improvements. Some years ago, as you've heard me say many times, in Flint, Michigan, a judge ordered that the county tear down the county jail because it was unfit for human habitation. And the jail was actually blown up. We bought some dynamite, I think, from Hubbard's Hardware and blew the jail up. But that jail was in better shape than some of the schools. And it's a shame when we do not make sure that our students have a decent, safe, and healthy place in which to study. You know, the federal budget is not merely a spreadsheet, it's a statement of our values. You can determine what a person's values are by how he or she spends his or her money. And you can tell how a government, what the values are by how that government spends its money. Until recently, the federal budget said that we did not value children like those in Flint enough to help them fix the buildings where they learn. And you know, children are smart. When they see schools crumbling around them, their school crumbling around them, while children just a few miles away, as is the case in Genesee County, Michigan, are in a very beautiful school, they know that our society has made the choice not to give them the kind of school building they deserve. This is not a message we can afford to send our children. That is why I was so pleased by the historic education funding that President Obama and Congress included in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and that school districts can use much of that funding to modernize their schools. This is an important principle, and this bill is the essential next step in that process, because it would provide a dedicated source of funding to improve school facilities. Last Congress, we passed this bill out of the House. I am confident by the end of this Congress, it will be law. I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues towards that end, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson, you have a statement? Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Miller, Ranking Member McKean. I appreciate the opportunity to speak towards an issue that's near and dear to my heart relative to this proposed bill, and relevant to the country as a whole as we move forward into the 21st century. As the committee well knows, we look to promote policies that will increase the competitiveness of our American workforce. And career and technical education does just that, shaping our young learners and providing them with the skills that they'll need to replace the baby boomer generation and lead the way on new jobs, high-tech jobs, jobs that our country will not be able to operate without. I had an amendment to offer today, a simple amendment to offer 5% of funds that a local education agency receives from the grants provided through this bill to be designated to modernization repair of a facility that solely houses a career and technical education program, should one exist under the jurisdiction of that LEA. But in my humble opinion, it is time that we get very serious about retooling our workforce and finding ways that will foster real economic growth with realistic and sustainable jobs. However, I believe we can assist the states most effectively through programming and not bricks and mortar. And while I'd like to see career and technical education benefit from this bill, I will not be offering my amendment today. I can in good faith offer my amendment because the underlying bill is fatally flawed. And while I'd like to negotiate and move through the democratic process, the fundamentals of what we have in front of us will not change. The federal government is overstepping its boundaries with this bill. Nationalization and regulation for schools is not the direction we should be heading. And I encourage my colleagues to consider the shortfalls in the allocation of funds for programming well before the federal government bites off more than what we can chew or our future generations can digest. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing from all of my colleagues, but we'd like to get out of here at 11:30. Mr. Lobisak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It really has been an honor and a pleasure working with you and Mr. Chandler and Mr. Kildee on this bill, and I'm extremely humbled, I should say, by Mr. Kildee's good words about me. Last year when we marked up a similar version of this legislation, I had the great opportunity to include many of the provisions of my own Public School Repair and Renovation Act and the Green School Improvement Act into the underlying bill, and I'm very glad the bill we introduced this year also contains those provisions. I will be voting in strong support of the substitute amendment, of course, because it does only improve upon the underlying bill. School facilities across this country are deteriorating. In older buildings, we've seen problems with lead paint and asbestos. We've also seen somewhat newer buildings experiencing problems with mold and poor indoor air quality. These examples really are just the tip of the iceberg. Problems vary region by region, state by state, and even district by district. We began to try to address the needs of schools, as was already mentioned, through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. This Congress made school modernization, repair, and renovation an allowable use of funding through the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. This is an important step forward, but it isn't enough, and more must be done. This bill will take us even further toward ending the inequality of funding for schools. This legislation provides $6.4 billion for school modernization in the first year, and the money goes out by formula, which is often the best way to reach schools most in need. I do, however, understand that there are still concerns about how the Title I formula works for rural America, and I will continue to work with my colleagues on this issue. This bill also focuses on the importance of greening schools. As districts plan for the modernization of school facilities, it is essential that they look closely at the health needs of students, teachers, and administrators. Many schools in my district and across the state have already begun to go green. In fact, last year, Dr. Paula Vincent from the Clear Creek Amana School District in Iowa testified before this committee about the benefits of green school construction. She said their efforts to go green had added significant investment value to the buildings and minimized many negative environmental impacts typically caused by new construction. A large and growing body of research demonstrates that green school technology can lead to increased health, learning ability, and productivity. This includes improved test scores, attendance, teacher retention, and satisfaction. This legislation makes a much-needed investment in school modernization, repair, and renovation, and emphasizes creating healthier environments through green technology. I think the bottom line is that there is a need. Students deserve better, and we can and should do more to leverage local funds to fix America's crumbling school infrastructure. And I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Paralucci.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to express my strong support for H.R. 2187 and the amendment in the nature of a substitute that you have submitted. I would like to commend both Congressman Chandler for introducing this important measure and Congressman Loebsack for his leadership in this area. H.R. 2187 provides support to our school districts to address a chronically underfunded need, school modernization and renovation. Because of the economic downturn, school budgets are being slashed. And needing to cut their own spending, school districts are forced to postpone or even forego the construction and renovation of rundown schools in favor of immediate expenses like teacher salaries. The modernization and renovation of schools is critical to raising student achievement and preparing students to enter the workforce. Research confirms what common sense suggests, namely that students' achievement is higher in well-maintained schools than in crumbling ones. It is not surprising that students perform better when placed in a learning environment that affirms the value of education. Just imagine the message a school sends to students about the importance of learning when it is filled with shattered windows, broken lockers, and out-of-date equipment. No student should be forced to learn under such conditions. The renovation of schools also allows for new technologies to be incorporated into these schools. New technology not only gives instructors additional teaching tools, but also exposes students to the type of technology they will be expected to use when they enter the workforce. Mr. Chairman, in the interest of brevity, I have listed only the educational benefits of this legislation, and I have omitted the positive effects this legislation would have on the environment and the economy. Needless to say, H.R. 2187 is good public policy, truly a win-win piece of legislation, and I urge my colleagues in this committee to support it. I yield back my time.
Yields back his time. Mr. Holt.
Mr. Chairman, I move to do whatever I need to do. Thank you very much for the floor.
Whatever the gentleman wants to do, he's free to do. Want to yield back your time?
Just very quickly, I would like to thank the chairman. I'd like to thank Representative Chandler and Chairman Kildee for their work on this, and to thank the manager for including language in this amendment that will provide technical assistance to local educational agencies and will make calculating the carbon footprint part of what the local schools will do, and the language that will lead to developing a school energy efficiency quality plan. I thank, and also, by the way, for including language for veterans-owned businesses for the contractors. With that, I thank the chairman and yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Tonko.
Mr. Miller. Chairman Miller, Ranker McKeon, and members of the committee, I believe that the amendment is an important addition to the outstanding work done by Representative Chandler and others in putting forth this measure. I believe that as this nation endures under several energy crises, it is essential to move forward and address buildings in our society as a major factor that contribute to the carbon footprint and that can be seen as a huge consumption of energy. So as we address our children and our taxpayers in our society through a measure like this that speaks to high-performing public schools, it is important to encourage, however possible, energy audits, energy efficiency concepts, and health-focused measures. I believe that the outcome is made much more strong simply by encouraging that kind of activity. As we calculate the benefit, it comes in many, many dimensions. It allows for our children to have a better quality of indoor air. With many students that are impacted by asthma and other chronic illnesses, that is important. It entrusts our children into a safe haven by using sound materials, non-toxic materials, creating energy-efficient retrofits into our school systems. It enables us to reduce that carbon footprint, teach by example as a society to our children, and then provide for savings, direct and indirect. However they're calculated, they can be shared with the tax-paying public or with our children, with investment in the classroom, rather than investing in the wastefulness and gluttonous consumption of energy that in some cases can be proven needless. So I think these measures are great improvements to the bill. I thank Chairman Miller for his very listening ear and for his constructive output by putting before us this amendment. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Kucinich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill makes a number of solid contributions that will help minimize global warming, pollution, and other environmental problems. It will create green jobs, improve education, and it will improve health. I'm pleased the chairman has included language in the manager's amendment that will allow funds to be used to remove lead-containing plumbing and any other sources of lead contamination in schools. The Environmental Protection Agency and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have both made the unusual declaration that there is no known safe level of exposure to lead. As research methods and detection technologies advance, we continue to find health effects of blood lead levels at concentrations previously thought to be safe. At levels of exposure that are startlingly close to that considered to be acceptable, commonly seen health effects include delays in neurological and physical development, learning disabilities, hyperactivity, lower IQ, hearing loss, reduced attention span, and extremely aggressive behavior. A growing body of research links criminal activity to exposure to lead, which stands to reason given this list of effects. Children are especially vulnerable. Children's brains and nervous systems, which are affected most by lead poisoning, develop the earliest in life and are therefore most susceptible to permanent damage. Their brains are affected at the very time when their cognitive abilities and their social skills are developing the fastest. Children consume more food and water by body weight than adults, and lead poisoning affects those of modest means and people of color disproportionately, making it even more difficult to overcome the disproportionate barriers they already face. Schools represent a particular area of need of attention. Many schools in older cities like Cleveland have an aging infrastructure. Some may include lead pipes. But age is not a comprehensive indicator of risk. Newer buildings also contain potential sources of lead, including solder, pipe fittings, faucets, valves, meters, and any fixtures containing brass. The longer water remains in contact with leaded plumbing, the more likely the lead will leach into the water. In fact, schools are worst-case scenarios for lead contamination because the water sits for days or weeks at a time, absorbing the lead out of the plumbing. In one study of lead levels in Arizona schools, 5 of the 6 samples in which lead was detected came from drinking fountains. Though testing is far from comprehensive, school systems in Seattle, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Jersey City, and Washington, D.C. have reported elevated lead levels in school drinking water. Cleveland has one of the highest rates of elevated blood levels in the country. The percentage of children under 6 years old with blood lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter, which is still way too high, was 22.2%. Lead paint is certainly the major contributor to this problem, but the contribution of lead in drinking water to this number is undeniably significant. We have an obligation to do everything we can to prevent a single child from bearing the entirely preventable burden of learning difficulties and aggressive tendencies. This manager's amendment and this bill brings us one step closer to that goal. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with the chairman to include this language, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time if there's no members who, further members who wish to be heard. Mr. Castle, I believe, has an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do. I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
An amendment offered
Staff
by
will distribute the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Castle of Delaware.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the amendment.
Mr. Kildee reserves a point of order, and the gentleman, Mr. Castle, is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment while it's being distributed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And in our the various opening statements, we were reminded, of course, that we considered this legislation last year, both in committee at a hearing and in passage in the committee, and then on the floor. Some of us had some concerns then, and I am addressing an issue that I believe should be considered as part of what we are doing here. It would not completely undermine the legislation. I have some problems with the legislation, but it would indeed, I think, benefit education the way we need to in this country. Last year when we had our hearings and during the markup, I expressed my strong belief that as Congress works to provide our nation's students with the best possible education and provide them with the tool to succeed, it is important to scrutinize whether the federal government can commit to providing yet another funding stream for a federal school construction program, especially when funding needs for federally mandated programs such as Title I are not currently being met. Title I is the subject of this particular amendment. Today, of course, the committee is considering the 21st Century High-Performing Public School Facilities Act, and although well-intentioned, I continue to have strong concerns of financing school construction at the federal level. Historically, the federal government has had an almost non-existent role in financing school construction projects. This changed a little bit with the stimulus bill, which would provide for the allowance of some construction if that decision is made at the state level. Rather, the responsibility for school construction has been at the state and local levels. which have spent over $144 billion in just the last 7 years, according to construction industry reports. It is also important to understand the cost implications of federal funding for school construction. Both the United States Department of Education and the United States Government Accountability Office, which we know as GAO, have attempted to project the needs and costs of construction on the state and local levels. According to U.S. Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics report, the unmet need for school construction and renovation is estimated at $112 billion. If the federal government gets involved in school construction projects, I am fearful that the number of projects will increase, and as a result, the need for funding will continue to grow. In fact, Mr. Chairman, I think you even mentioned a higher number in your opening statement, and I'm sure it would grow if indeed the federal government is taking over a good deal of the construction. Federal involvement would also undermine the authority and decision-making ability of state and local officials who are in a better position to tailor programs and more closely meet their students' unique needs and priorities. Our decisions must be based on existing commitments and greatest needs, such as assisting school districts and schools in meeting federally imposed mandates, including funding for Title I. Currently, this program is not being adequately funded, despite repeated congressional assurances. This amendment begins to address the many concerns I have surrounding this bill by requiring the Title I program for low-income students to be fully funded before creating a new federal school construction program. Under No Child Left Behind, Congress authorized $25 billion for the Title I program that provides financial assistance to local educational agencies and schools with high numbers or high percentages of poor children to help ensure that all children meet challenging state academic standards. Last year, Congress provided $14.5 billion for the Title I program, more than $10 billion below the authorized funding level. And I would say, Mr. Chairman, that there are members of this committee, both Republicans and Democrats, who fought hard to get that number higher, but it's still $10 billion below the authorized funding level. From my perspective, voting in support of this amendment would ensure that Congress keeps making progress toward meeting the funding goals for the Title I program for low-income students. We have an obligation at the federal level to provide the funding to the programs which directly improve student achievement and close the achievement gaps that have persisted for decades between disadvantaged students and their more affluent peers. Certainly, I recognize the challenge of fully funding these programs. Although Republicans made tremendous progress and we were in the majority providing historic increases for these programs, neither party has yet been able to reach the lofty funding goals we have set forth. The purpose of my amendment is not to point fingers about these funding shortfalls, but simply to prevent us from erecting further barriers to reaching our goals. Congress and this committee must set our nation's priorities and keep our promise to low-income students. I encourage my colleagues to support my amendment. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Mr. Kildee? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
Mr. Kildee withdraws his reservation. I think there is a question whether this is germane or not, but we allowed it last year in the markup, and it's my intent to allow it at this point. And the chair recognized himself for 5 minutes. I would hope that the committee would reject this amendment. I don't think this is an issue of either or. We all understand the priorities that this committee and Congress has placed on IDEA and on Title I. In fact, we reestablished that commitment in the Recovery Act when we provided $12 billion in IDEA funds over the next 2 years and $13 billion in Title I funds over the next 2 years. It's very clear that school construction is important to many members of this Congress and certainly to school districts all across the country. Those priorities will have to be sorted out both by the Budget Committee and the Appropriations Committee. This authorizes this program to go forward. I think that this bill is important. It establishes a lot of assistance to local districts. There's no suggestion in the sponsors of this bill that this will take care of all of the problems, or that this that this should be fully funded at the expense of other programs. But those are the budget priorities that we'll work through in the process and the appropriation should this bill become law. And I would hope that we would reject this amendment to suggest that we can't go forward in any other priorities until Title I is fully funded. And I yield back the balance of my time. Are there others who wish to speak on this amendment? If not, the question comes on the amendment by the gentleman from Delaware, Mr. Castle. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion share, the noes appear to have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Roll call.
Gentleman asked for roll call under previous agreements. We will postpone the roll call until all amendments have been considered. Mr. Polis is recognized for purpose of offering an amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank Representative Chandler, Mr. Kildee, and Mr. Loebsack for their work on this bill. Very important bill, and I'll speak briefly on that before transitioning to the amendment. I had the chance 3 years ago to chair the bond campaign in Boulder Valley School District, one of the districts that I represent. We raised $297 million, mostly to green and update Boulder Valley School District schools. Now, Boulder Valley School District is a relatively wealthy suburban school district, serves only a small percentage of kids on free and reduced lunch, and I also represent several districts like Mapleton and Westminster 50. Mapleton's been on the ballot twice and has not been able to pass a much more meager capital allotment to improve and update their schools. Colorado is a state that does a fairly good job on the operational side, on the equalization side, on operating revenue. We fund our at-risk districts at about the same as we fund our wealthier districts, but the disparities on the capital side have grown more pronounced. This bill will help address that by investing in the school districts that don't have the ability to compete by creating facilities that allow kids to get the same quality of education that they do in the wealthier districts. What my amendment specifically does is address the issue of the treatment of charter schools, and the current language in the bill works for many charter schools and districts. Indeed, in an ideal world, all charter schools and their authorizing agencies would have very close working relationships. That is, in fact, sometimes the case. However, for every time that is the case, both in Colorado as well as nationally, we can point to other cases where there is what one might kindly call a dysfunctional relationship between the charter school and their chartered entity. That is something that's unfortunate, and perhaps something that in other legislation we can address with both the carrot and the stick to try to facilitate close relationships between public charter schools and their chartering entities. But it is simply the reality, and many times that's the charter school's fault, many times it's the district's fault, many times it's both of their faults, many times it's neither of their faults. But the language with regard to an equitable portion leaves too much room to be interpreted, indeed, by giving the exclusive right to essentially the chartering entity in this case to deny any funds to what might in fact be a school that serves very high at-risk kids. As we know nationally, charter schools serve a higher percentage of free and reduced lunch kids and also have less capital investment nationally. So all this amendment would do is ensure that chartering entities, districts, LEAs allocate a percentage of these capital funds that represent the percentage of kids in their district that are free and reduced lunch eligible that are enrolled in charter schools. So again, while we might hope for a world where this type of clarity is not necessary in federal law, we're not there yet. And in fact, by using the current language, I would fear that we would open the door in many areas where the dysfunctional relationships do exist to nasty political fighting, lawsuits, and in fact, some of the help that we hope to provide, rather than going right to projects at schools, being eaten up in both time and effort and dollars by adults, unfortunately, fighting over who controls what. So I think that by using this proposed language, we can reduce the amounts of those fights at the local level and make sure that, as is our intent, this money actually reaches the schools that serve at-risk kids, which is what we're trying to do to close that disparity between the quality of the facilities among schools that serve at-risk families and schools that serve wealthy families. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yield.
Yes.
Is charter schools defined somewhere in the bill? Question is whether or not these are public charter schools or private charter schools.
It was not in the section that we changed, and I believe we're only referring to public charter schools in this case. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I oppose the bill on principle, if you're going to go down this path, I think in fairness, charter schools should be considered and they are public schools, as has been clarified. So I think that I would like to encourage all members to support the gentleman's amendment. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I also would encourage people to support the amendment. I do, however, want to say to the author of the amendment, and we discussed this, I have two concerns about the amendment. One, that I'm not sure that it's clear that if you want to start a charter school, you're not there yet, whether or not money could be made available to you because of the way the formulas work. So I'd like to work on that to assure that that money could be used to renovate a facility for the purposes of opening or creating a charter school. And secondly, that in the second part of your language, you have the needs as determined by the agency in consultation with the charter school, which is fine. I think that's a better way to go, to have the agency and work this out in that kind of arrangement. But if the needs aren't demonstrated, I don't want the money to just sit in a pool when there are other needs in other Title I schools or other schools in that district to be met, because in fact the charter schools may be, you know, in decent state or whatever. However the agency determines that, if they decide that those needs aren't as great as others, I don't want that to be an escape clause, but at the same time we want that money to be used to benefit other students in that district. So I'd like to work with you before we go to the floor with this amendment, either to include changes in the manager's amendment or a separate amendment on the floor. But I would encourage all members of the committee to support this this amendment to the bill. All those, the question comes on the amendment by the gentleman from Colorado. All those in favor would say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The next amendment is Mr. Klein. You have an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Klein of Minnesota.
I have a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Keeley reserves the point of order. The clerk, the staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment while it's being distributed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have many of the same concerns about this base bill and the amendment in the nature of substitute that have already been expressed by Ranking Member McKeon and Mr. Castle. But if we're going to go forward here with this legislation, which is certainly well-intentioned, this 21st Century Green High-Performing Public Schools Facility Act would provide funds to some school districts across the nation and would no doubt be well received. But not every school district needs this money or can even use this money. Every school district, on the other hand, needs money to meet the federal mandate for special education. In 2004, Congress passed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004, which established a clear and genuine pattern to reach the 40% goal, and that was our federal obligation when IDEA was originally passed, to reach that 40% goal by 2011. But Mr. Chairman, everyone in this committee knows we've never come close. I was looking at the funding stream going back to 1977, and I can tell you there were 16 straight years where the federal government did not reach 10%, much less the 40% which it was obligated to spend. We started an increase in spending in 1998. It grew steadily to reach a peak in 2005, which was 18.5%, less than half of what the federal government was supposed to spend. Even, Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned, with the stimulus bill, we had a spurt of more money for IDEA. We reached 34%, still short of the 40% that the federal government is obligated to spend. We have had debates in this committee and in this Congress and around the nation over unfunded mandates for education. The No Child Left Behind debate was often couched in this is an unfunded mandate terminology. That is certainly questionable, but it is not questionable for IDEA, for special ed. That is a mandate. Every school must comply with that, and the federal government ought to meet its obligations. Mr. Chairman, you said there are budget priorities, and I would agree. But our first priority ought to be to meet this commitment that we made so many years ago. We should not start new government programs, new federal programs, until we show that we can meet this commitment. So, Mr. Chairman, I would ask that we recognize those budget priorities, that we agree finally that we're going to fully fund special ed before we take up a new program, however well-intentioned, and I would ask all of my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time, and the chair is recognized for 5 minutes. I would urge again the committee to reject this amendment. The arguments are pretty much the same as we just discussed in the previous Castle amendment. I think this is an important priority. Many members of Congress do, many districts do, and many families that send their kids to school believe that the condition of their schools is a very high priority. This again is legislation that authorizes the government to go forward. The determination of whether or not the money will be committed or not is one that will be made in the budget and the appropriations process, both at the administration and in the Congress. I think that clearly, again, we made a very serious statement and commitment on IDEA over the next 2 years with the recovery funds, with the addition of those monies to school districts based upon the IDEA formula, and I would ask for a no vote.
Withdraw my reservation.
And Mr. Kildee withdraws his reservation. The question comes. Oh, excuse me.
Mr. Chairman, with respect to this amendment, in which you're using the same argument against my amendment as we deal with IDA and Title I, and I'm not denigrating anyone's efforts here, particularly yours. You've probably been as strong an advocate for funding IDA and Title I as anybody here, but it does concern me, and I realize, and I listen to what you said, that's the decision that the Budget Committee and the appropriators and the White House working with them will make in terms of how these are going to be funded in the future. But with all the pushing that we have done for the years I've been here, and probably the years before that when you were here, we simply haven't gotten that done to the level we should. And to me, this is an opportunity to fund those programs that we have an obligation to fund, which we know truly help children, and I don't think would greatly impair what this legislation is all about. I may have some other problems with this legislation, but the bottom line is that it seems to me that both in Title I and IDEA, that this is an opportunity for this committee to step forward and say, these are federal obligations. We know they can truly help children which have great needs, and we need to push even harder than we have before. And even though we've made improvement in recent years, I just think we need the extra push to get us to where we need to be. So I'm imploring you to perhaps look at what we're doing and perhaps consider your position on this, because I know that you're supportive of what we are trying to do, maybe not in the way we're doing it, but in what we're trying to do. And I would hope that this could be reconsidered, this being your position, sir.
That being my position, in strong support of IDEA and Title I, that will continue to be my position, as will be in strong support of improving our public school facilities. And the question comes on the amendment by Mr. Klein. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote.
Mr. Klein asked for a recorded vote, and again, in accordance with Clause 2H of Rule 11, further proceedings in this amendment will be postponed. I believe we have Mr. Sestak has an amendment. The gentleman is recognized for his amendment. The clerk will designate the amendment, and the staff will distribute the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Sestak of Pennsylvania.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment has to do with a noise-free learning environment. This bill actually addresses this issue of acoustics by saying that funding can be used for plumbing, it can be used for sewage systems, can be used for doors and windows, but it's missing several items. The reason I'm interested is twofold. I was a little late for the markup today because I was at Children's Hospital with my daughter, and after her brain tumor and going several brain operations and chemotherapy and radiation, she has a hearing loss among some other issues. So we had the audiologist this morning. And so she joins about 20% of children in schools that have academic difficulties associated with some minimal degree or some degree of hearing loss. I also bring it back to my district, and I think other places, Chicago or New York City, may have similar issues. And we provided these studies as the FAA has proposed that planes will now take off from Philadelphia International Airport, take a right turn over Delaware County in my district, and at 500 feet. Statistical studies have shown that children in schools that these planes will be flying over between first grade and the end of high school will lose 1 year of educational prowess. So, although it's a personal issue to some degree, I guess I really turn to that because it's affecting my district, and I think it affects other ones. And if funding is to be used for some of these systems to help acoustics, I think that we should also do it for ceilings and floors. And it sounds like a small issue, but statistically, without these mitigation efforts, if you're in an income area where you just can't afford to leave, it would help a lot, I think, if these children don't have their academic prowess hurt because of whatever type of airspace environment we place them in. So that's why this amendment is submitted, and I appreciate consideration.
Those who wish to be heard on the amendment? If not, the question comes on the amendment by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes appear to have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Mr. McKeon?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment, and the staff will distribute the amendment. And the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment is a common-sense change to the bill that would require local educational agencies to conduct an independent audit by a third-party entity substantiating the overall condition of their public school facilities. It's similar to the amendment offered last year by Dr. Price, and I want to thank him for his leadership on this issue. While accurate estimates are difficult to obtain, the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Government Accountability Office have attempted to estimate the project the needs and costs of school construction on the state and local level. According to a report released by the U.S. Department of Education's National Center for Educational Statistics entitled Public School Principals Report on Their School Facilities, Fall 2005, the unmet need for school construction and renovation is estimated at $112 billion, and 3/4 of the nation's schools report needing funds to bring their buildings into a good overall condition. However, the National Education Association estimates this figure at more than $300 billion, which is a wide difference. The problem with getting an accurate figure on the needs of state and local school districts when it comes to school construction is that there has never been a comprehensive and independent audit or analysis, such as one conducted by an independent assessor on the nation's school construction needs. Even the Department of Education and GAO studies are based upon self-reporting of construction needs by school superintendents and other officials, which is not exactly an accurate indicator to base the creation of a new $20 billion school construction program. In order to address this situation, my amendment seeks to put in place a system that will answer the questions surrounding the state of our nation's elementary and secondary schools, which will hopefully guide some of the spending decisions under this bill. It will also ensure that local educational agencies obtain the necessary expertise on the condition of their schools and what is needed to ensure that all students are educated in safe and healthy schools around the country. In short, this amendment ensures that if we spend federal taxpayer dollars for school construction, we invest those resources where they are needed in the amount that is needed. And when I served on local school board, we had some real problems in the district with long-term maintenance needs. And while we had great expertise in the district in teaching, in running schools, and the general overall running of a school district, we really didn't have strong expertise in school construction, in school maintenance, and special needs such as roofing and so forth. So our superintendent, at some risk, brought in local builders, local people that had the expertise. And I say risk because, you know, if they could come in and point out that he hadn't been doing a very good job on maintenance. So it was a risky thing, but I think it was a wise thing. And we got some good information from these people, and we were able to set aside money that we used on an ongoing basis for bringing these buildings up to good condition, good shape through an ongoing maintenance program. This is not an adversarial amendment in any way. This is one that I think is, you know, we hear a lot about bipartisanship. I think this is an amendment that would make the bill better, even though I'm in principle opposed to the bill. I still think this amendment would make it better, and I would urge all members to support the amendment.
I think the gentleman's amendment, the chair is recognized for 5 minutes. I believe that the gentleman's amendment is helpful to the bill. The gentleman on the other side of the aisle believe that this bill is wrong because it's such a major undertaking in terms of federal resources. We believe it's important because it's a major undertaking of federal resources, but what we ought to know is exactly, on some independent basis, a benchmark for us to proceed. And you're right, there's no shortage of reports about the problem, and we ought to establish that benchmark, and I would hope the committee would accept the amendment. Are there others who wish to be heard? Then the question comes on the amendment by the gentleman from California. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the... Is there dissension on the other side of the aisle? If there's no further amendments, then we will take the roll call votes that were requested on Mr. Castle's amendment and Mr. Klein's amendment, and then we will proceed to final passage. So the first one will be on Mr. Castle, and the clerk will call a roll.
Chairman Miller.
No.
Chairman Miller votes no. Mr. Kildee.
No.
Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Payne. Mr. Andrews. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes no. Ms. Woolsey. Ms. Woolsey votes no. Mr. Hinojosa. Mr. Hinojosa votes no. Mrs. McCarthy. Mrs. McCarthy votes no. Mr. Tierney.
You're just what, that's Riverside County.
Mr. Kucinich.
Not Riverside.
Mr. Wu. No. Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Holt. No. Mr. Holt votes no. Mrs. Davis. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Bishop of New York. Mr. Bishop of New York votes no.
Tell him you won't go.
Mr. Sestak. Mr. Sestak votes no. Mr. Loebsack. No. Mr. Loebsack votes no. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Altmeyer. Mr. Altmeyer votes no. Mr. Hare. Mr. Hare votes no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Shea Porter.
The fudge factor next.
Ms. Fudge.
No.
Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Polis.
No.
Mr. Polis votes no. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Pierluisi. No. Mr. Pierluisi votes no. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Titus. Mr. McKeon. Mr. McKeon votes aye. Mr. Petri. Mr. Petri votes aye. Mr. Hoekstra. Mr. Hoekstra votes aye. Mr. Castle. Mr. Castle votes aye. Mr. Souter. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Ehlers votes aye. Mrs. Biggert. Mr. Platts. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein votes aye. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Bishop of Utah. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter votes aye. Mr. Rowe. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Payne. Mr. Platts is not recorded. Mr. Platts votes aye. Mr. Souter is not recorded. Mr. Souter votes aye. Mr. Payne is not recorded.
No.
Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Andrews.
No.
Mr. Andrews votes no. Mr. Tierney. Mr. Tierney votes no. Mr. Kucinich. Mr. Kucinich votes no. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono votes no. Ms. Shea Porter. Ms. Shea Porter votes no. Ms. Titus. Mrs. Biggert. Mr. Price. Mr. Bishop of Utah. Mr. Rowe.
Clerk will announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 15 members vote aye and 28 members vote no.
And the amendment is not agreed to. The next vote will come on the Klein amendment dealing with IDA funding and school construction. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Miller.
No.
Chairman Miller votes no. Mr. Kildee?
No.
Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Payne? No. Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Andrews? No. Mr. Andrews votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Ms. Woolsey? Ms. Woolsey votes no. Mr. Hinojosa? Mr. Hinojosa votes no. Mrs. McCarthy? Mrs. McCarthy votes no. Mr. Tierney? Mr. Tierney votes no. Mr. Kucinich? Mr. Kucinich votes no. Mr. Wu? Mr. Wu votes no. Mr. Holt? No. Mr. Holt votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Bishop of New York? No. Mr. Bishop of New York votes no. Mr. Sestak? Mr. Sestak votes no. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack votes no. Ms. Hirono? Ms. Hirono votes no. Mr. Altmeyer? Mr. Altmeyer votes no. Mr. Hare? Mr. Hare votes no. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Shea Porter? Ms. Shea Porter votes no. Ms. Fudge?
No.
Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Polis?
No.
Mr. Polis votes no. Mr. Tonko?
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Pierluisi votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Titus? Mr. McKeon? Mr. McKeon votes aye. Mr. Petri? Mr. Petri votes aye. Mr. Hoekstra? Mr. Hoekstra votes aye. Mr. Castle? Mr. Castle votes aye. Mr. Souter? Mr. Souter votes aye. Mr. Ehlers? Mr. Ehlers votes aye. Mrs. Biggert? Mr. Platts? Mr. Platts votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers? Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Bishop of Utah? Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Cassidy? Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Hunter? Mr. Hunter votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye.
Announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 15 members vote aye, 28 members vote no.
And the amendment is not agreed to. And the chair will recognize Mr. Kildee for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the Committee on Education and Labor report the bill H.R. 2187 to the House of Representatives in the form of a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating any amendments adopted with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
The question now is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. The gentleman from California, Mr. McKeon, requests a roll call. Roll call will be ordered, and the clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Miller?
Aye.
Chairman Miller votes aye. Mr. Kildee?
Aye.
Mr. Kildee votes aye. Mr. Payne? Aye. Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Andrews? Mr. Andrews votes aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Ms. Woolsey? Ms. Woolsey votes aye. Mr. Hinojosa? Mr. Hinojosa votes aye. Mrs. McCarthy? Mrs. McCarthy votes aye. Mr. Tierney? Mr. Tierney votes aye. Mr. Kucinich? Mr. Kucinich votes aye. Mr. Wu? Mr. Wu votes aye. Mr. Holt? Mr. Holt votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Bishop of New York? Mr. Bishop of New York votes aye. Mr. Sestak? Mr. Sestak votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono votes aye. Mr. Altmeyer. Mr. Altmeyer votes aye. Mr. Hare. Mr. Hare votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Shea Porter. Ms. Shea Porter votes aye. Ms. Fudge. Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Polis.
Aye.
Mr. Polis votes aye. Mr. Tonko.
Aye.
Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Pierluisi. Mr. Pierluisi votes aye. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. McKeon.
No.
Mr. McKeon votes no. Mr. Petri. No. Mr. Petri votes no. Mr. Hoekstra.
No.
Mr. Hoekstra votes no. Mr. Castle. Mr. Castle votes no. Mr. Souter. Mr. Souter votes no. Mr. Ehlers. Mr. Ehlers votes aye. Mrs. Biggert. Mr. Platts. Mr. Platts votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no. Mr. Price. Mr. Bishop of Utah. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter votes no. Mr. Rowe. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson votes no.
How is Mr. Wilson recorded?
Mr. Wilson is recorded as having voted aye. Mr. Wilson votes no.
We done? Yeah. The clerk will announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 31 members vote aye and 13 members vote no.
And the motion is agreed to, and the bill is agreed to favorably report the bill. The chair notes the presence of a quorum, and the chair recognizes Mr. Kildee.
I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical and conforming changes to H.R. 2187 as reported by the committee today, and that pursuant to House Rule 11, all members have the requisite number of days to file additional or minority views on the bill reported today.
The chair would ask unanimous consent that Mr. Rowe be allowed to be recorded on the roll call on final passage. It will not change the outcome, so the chair has no objection. Mr. Rowe, how do you wish to be recorded? Oh, then that can't be allowed, no. Yes, gentleman's recorded as no. Thank you. Without objections to Mr. Kildee's amendment on the unanimous consent, I mean, is requesting unanimous consent for technical changes. The motion is agreed, order is agreed to. And with that, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you, Dale.